I have the pleasure to introduce you today Professor Zaal Andronikashvili. He's a research fellow at the Center for Literary and Cultural Studies in Berlin and professor at the Ilia State University. He studied history, archaeology, and German philology in Tbilisi and Zaal and completed his PhD at the Georgian University in 2005 on generation of drama text. Towards the theory of plot, Berlin 2008. Currently, he coordinates a project at the Center for Literary and Cultural Studies, funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. The project name is Batumi, Odessa, Trabzon, Cultural Semantics of Black Sea from the perspective of Eastern port cities.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I can vividly remember our beautiful conference in Namur several years ago. What I will be talking about today is the perception of the cultural space in Georgia. And in Georgia it means that basically it's in Georgian literature and Georgian culture, which is of course not valid for every groups or minorities in Georgia. For example, if you look at the Greek community or Turkish community, it might be slightly different. So we speak about Georgian, well, let's say, national discourse and the space according to this Georgian national discourse. The idea was, so I have two, well, basic theses from which I started my thinking about this issue. The first one is the cultural meaning is not stable, it changes, it is cultural and it changes with the time. The second one is because it changes with the time, it is not limited to one group, but several different groups can have different ideas about one and the same space. And out of this, well, basic ideas, several projects were born, like Cultural Semantics of Georgia, and then the next one about Cultural Semantics of Black Sea. And I started to think about how Georgians related to the Black Sea, what Black Sea meant in this big spatial idea, and how this sea or maritime space was related to other spaces, for example to the land or to the mountains. And cultural semantics, just briefly say a couple of words, was the method which I, with my colleagues, developed to discover not the cultural memory of groups, like, for example, Georgians or I don't know, other people, but cultural memory which is inscribed to things and spaces. A familiar example for the audience here might be Marcel Proust, where the young Marcel is thinking about Balbec, for example, and he's asking different friends of his father, what is Balbec? And Charles Swann says, for example, Balbec is this is a Gothic cathedral, and tells about the culture there. And another friend of his father, I think he's Legrandin, says that this is a nature landscape and so on. So this scape can have definitely this kind of very different meanings, and these meanings are not something, not the meanings that are perpetuated by one group, but sedimented to the things or to the landscapes. And Black Sea is one of the examples. So what is the Black Sea idea of Georgians? Long before Georgia was associated with Caucasus, and this is maybe the main geographical attribution, today's West Georgia was known in ancient times in the Argonaut myth, which is also one of the big references, as Colchis, as the land of the Golden Fleece. It belongs to the great ancient mythical cycles. The Argonauts are already being an issue by Hesiod and Homer in the 12th century BC. In the song of the Odyssey, the Argonauts are mentioned one generation before the War of Troy, one generation before of Troyans. The myth was formulated at large in Argonautica by Apollonius of Rhodos in the 3rd century before Christ. The legend of the Argonauts was one of the most popular plots of antiquity. Aeschylus and Sophocles are said to written tragedies about Argonauts, but unlike the Medea of Euripides, they are not or only fragmentary preserved. Ovidius and Seneca also devoted themselves to the Argonaut subject. Even after antiquity, this subject was one of the most popular in the European literature, so it survived and was also popular in the Renaissance. And after the Renaissance, the east coast of the Black Sea is still marked with the golden fleece on medieval maps. For example, there is one very famous map, Hereford Mappa Mundi, where you see the golden fleece, which marks geographically the Colchis, or the eastern shore of the Black Sea. Of all the richness of versions and processings of the Argonaut saga, Georgian literature knew nothing about it until 18th century. Some Georgian medieval translations of Byzantine texts and some church fathers mention shortly and very secondary episodes of the Argonaut saga, such as the sowing of dragon teeth. However, the focus is neither on Colchis nor on Medea. It was not until the 18th century when Prince Lahushti deals with the Argonaut saga in his geography of Georgia. In the second half of the 18th century. But the first detailed description to be found is in the encyclopedia or encyclopedic work of Prince Ioane Kalmasoba in the 19th century, and in the history of Iveria. Iveria is another name of Georgia, Iveria, of his brother Prince Leonidas. However, both Kalmasoba and Iveri's Historia were written after the forced immigration of the Georgian royal family to Russia, to St. Petersburg. Both of them obtained their knowledge of the Colchis and the Argonauts from Russian translations of ancient authors or from Russian texts. Akaki Tsereteli, who was one of the most famous writers and the most beloved Georgian poet of the 19th century, made the first significant attempt to discover the Argonaut saga for Georgian literature with his drama Medea, 1893-1895. Unlike most Medea dramas, he moved the plot from Corinth to Colchis, which is very typical from Georgia. So after that, most of Georgian Argonaut stories will be placed not in Colchis, not in Corinth, but in Colchis. So it's more the mythical part than the dramatic part. Thus, following the epic tradition, in these dramas, Tsereteli rationalized, nationalized, and politicized the myth, thus establishing not only a tradition of Georgian reception of the Argonaut saga, but also a semantic charge of the Western Georgia as Colchis. So he was the first one basically who said in Georgian discourse that Western Georgia is Colchina. Tsereteli tries to nationalize the Greek myth in two ways. On the one hand, he connects the Argonaut saga with the Georgian Amirani saga, and Amirani is Georgian counterpart of Prometheus, so very different, but Tsereteli is also the first one who says these two figures are identical. On the other hand, Tsereteli uses an Argonaut myth as a political metaphor for the conquest of Georgia by the Russian Empire. Greece thus stands for Russia in the Medea drama. This political nuance is reinforced in the dialogue between Iata, this is the name of Aietis in Tsareteli's drama, and his wife Gekada, in which Iata reveals an anti-colonial effect. He says the friendship with the Greeks does not bring anything to Colchis because the Greeks are known throughout the world for their betrayal, their ingratitude, their arrogance towards other people, and their arrogant boasting of their own ethnicity. Well, these are not Greeks, these are for Tsareteli Russians. They would not respect the customs of other peoples. With them, the women are the serfs of their husbands, while in Colchis they are free and independent. There, he does not want. Therefore, he does not want to marry Medea to Jason, who at that time had won the competition with the help of Medea, of course, and Medea's brother. But he wants to marry Medea, the son of the Mama Sachlisi of Tseta. Mama Sachlisi of Tseta. Mama Sachlisi is a Georgian term for not for a king, but for a head of the household, which is a political head of the state. And this is a very subtle political argument because Tsareteli refers to the Georgian romantic poet Alexander Chavchavadze, and who in his turn refers to the Georgian chronicle Katlis Horeba, where it is said that Alexander of Macedonia conquered Tseta, and one of the sons of Mama Sachlisi of Tseta, or the son of the Mama Sachlisi of Tseta, Parnavas, then freed Georgia and established the first Georgian kingdom. So what Tsareteli basically wants to do, he says that the idea of the unification of Georgian kingdom is more important than Georgia's, let's say, connection to the great empire. This is his subtle political argument. So he places the nationalist program, unification of the related tribes, Georgian tribes, above the foreign policy alliances with foreign large countries and empires. Believe me, he says to his wife, only kinship is the underpart of happiness in this world because one experiences joy and suffering together. But Iata's plan that Jason will die in the fight against Bulls and Dragons and that he can forge the wedding alliance with the East Georgian Mama Sachlisi does not work out. The Colchian priests are corruptible. Iata's son and Medea's brother are, well, very... so they're friends with Jason, and Medea is in love with Jason and can't even be brought to reason by the magic of Kirke, who is the sister of Ayet and great sorcerers. All together, Jason betrays the secrets of the Colchians so that he can win and escape with the treasure and with Medea. On the way, Jason sacrificed Medea's brother Iasir, which is Apsyrtus, and the Colchis, who has no ships, which is also very significant, cannot stop the fugitives. Iata swears revenge, but loses his mind. With this drama, Tsareteli continued the romantic national discourse. Happiness, both private and political, is not to be found in the foreign country, but in the homeland. But he introduces an important difference. He turns Black Sea into a foreign figure, so not familiar to Georgian. Black Sea is foreign. It is marked with foreignness. And the treat comes from outside, while the national center of gravity lies in the interior. It is in the middle of Georgia, it is in Kalki. The center of Georgia is in Kalki, not in the west. After Tsareteli, this new semantic turn of Georgian topography was taken up again and again. With his drama, Tsareteli not only introduced the myth of Argonauts in the Georgian literature, but also reacted to the cultural change in the topographical and geopolitical perception of the sea in Georgia. So it's a very important point because the perception of the sea in the 19th century and for more than 150 years is shaped by the romantic understanding of Georgian landscape, where the center is in the east or in the mountains, and the mountains are center of Georgia, and the sea is something extremely alien, foreign, and dangerous. Now I will come to my second point, which is a little bit more back in time than Tsareteli was. Georgia always had been a Black Sea country, but in its symbolic spatial order, or let's say in the symbolical geography, to quote Said, it had no right place for the sea. In the Middle Ages, the symbolic topography was oriented toward the sacred places of the Christian world, with Jerusalem in its center. In Georgia, Jerusalem corresponded to Zgheta, the old capital of Kartli, which is also in eastern Georgia, where, according to tradition, the robe of Christ was found. Although the sea is also present in historical texts, it has no special meaning. So we have the sea, but it has no meaning, it's neutral. Georgian scholar, very famous Georgian scholar, historian of religion and translator of Bible and Gilgamesh into Georgian, Zurab Ignadze, has identified two major pre-modern fields of significance of the sea in Georgian culture: the foreign and the written dangers. He finds the first meaning in the medieval Georgian novel or epos, the Night in the Pentaski, the Christausani, roughly from the 12th century. It describes the sea kingdom of Bulan Sharo, which in many respects is a counterpart to the paradigmatic land kingdoms of Arabia and India. So these are the model kingdoms, how they should be, and Bulan Sharo is something different. From which, Arabia and India are the countries of the protagonists of the poem Aftanbil and Daria, and of the queens Nestan, Darajan and Tinat. In both empires, so in Arabia and India, the empires are rather knightly, chevaleresque. Bulan Shara, although it is a kingdom, but it is rather dominated by the merchants, which is much lower in the ethical hierarchy of the poem. In addition, Nestan Darajan, the Indian princess and lover of the warrior in the tiger skin, Ariel, is banished by her aunt, the sorceress Davar. So we have the sorcerers everywhere as aunts, to the middle of the sea. So she's banished. The place of banishment is the middle of the seas. We don't know exactly where it geographically is, but she's banished to the middle of the seas, where she never arrives, actually. Where she's to perish for her misdeed. And misdeed is that she commissioned her lover, Ariel, to kill her fiancé. As an Indian heir to the throne, Nestan is at the center of the earth. So when she's in India, she's in the center of the earth. As a criminal and sinner, she is sent to the center of the seas. This also expresses the hierarchy between land and sea. But the sea only stands for the foreign in Rustaveli's poem. There are no correspondences in the other pre-modern Georgian texts, so it's the only one. The second connotation associated with the sea, the threatening one of the dangerous one, Ignadze locates in the popular belief. So it's a popular culture, or let's say ethnography. However, Ignadze believes that the fragmentary sea myth in Georgian culture, which he reconstructs on the basis of the folk poetry, is not the result of an actual, realistic experience, but a spontaneous expression of the archetypal model in which the sea is connected to chaos and the land is connected to the order. The folklore poems he analyzes describe the struggle of the Queen Tamar. Queen Tamar is the most important queen in the Georgian history, and to be said, the one to whom Rustaveli dedicated his poem, The Night in the Pentaski. So the Queen Tamar is the protagonist, and she is struggling with the sea. The queen, I quote, stands on the border between land and sea. The aim of the war is to shift the border in order to wrest land from the sea, just as it happened in the origin of the cosmogon. So she is a cosmetor. She wins the land from the sea, like we see in the Faust or other, maybe lots of plots in the history of the world literature. Even if Tamar warns the sea and is thus also a conqueror of a part of the sea, since she set the new border between land and sea in the middle of the sea, she remains the ruler of the land. So she didn't become the ruler of the sea, but she remains the ruler of the land, and the sea is an alien space. She acts on the land as a demiurge and the order maker, kosmedon. The sea is not included in the territorial names. The sea remains chaos, which threatens to devour the land again and again. This would divide Georgian culture with regard to the sea. So folk culture, mostly known from the folklore material collected in the eastern Georgian mountains, with no actual relation to the sea, transfers the pre-Christian semantic of chaotic element to the sea, which is to be conquered again and again by various demiurges, to which historical persons can also ascend in order to create order. The pre-modern high culture, on the other hand, remains mostly indifferent to the sea, and, as with Rustaveli, charges it with the meaning of foreign and other. Until the 18th century, maritime metaphors were essentially characterized by Old and New Testament imagery. There, the sea tends to be a negative element, which is compared with the moving and dangerous life, while the quiet harbor is used as a metaphor for paradise and eternal life. And afterwards, so after the Ereteli, or after the 19th century, we have a large corpus of the text which deals with the sea, and we have, for example, Andronikashvili's Lake of Balyastomi, where archaic thalassophobian aspects can be seen, and we have, of course, Georgian symbolists, and Jordan Lutzkanov told about Tizian Tabidze, spoke about Tizian Tabidze yesterday. We have also Valerian Andronikashvili with his sea poems, and then we have the Soviet idea of cultism. And I will just briefly speak about this, so I don't need Tizian Tabidze because Jordan Lutzkanov spoke about it at large, and you already know everything which is sufficient about it. Maybe I could add something to this Tizian moment, because he's one of the rare Georgian authors, or not only Georgian authors, who sees the ambivalence of the sea. So the sea and the land are not charged with a stable meaning, like dangerous or good or bad or life and death or something like this, but Kolchis and Black Sea is ambivalent. And Medea for him, which is a figuration of Kolchis, and this is the first time in Georgian history where Medea becomes a figure of Kolchis, a national figure, she is also ambivalent. So she has these both parts. On the one hand, she's of course the murderess of her children, but she's also a great sorcerer and healer. So this is maybe one important thing we should know about Tabidze's. The creation of Soviet Kolchis, and the Soviets had this idea to dry the swamps and to build up a new subtropic paradise in Kolchis, and then what was interesting and absolutely untypical for the Soviet projects, because we have this kind of great industry projects in Belamur Canal and other things, so the channel of the White Sea and other great projects. The unique and very significant aspect of the Kolchian project was that the Soviets, maybe for the first time, discovered the importance of history. So they appropriated the Argonaut, not the Argonaut myth, but the myth of Kolchis, of golden Kolchis, for their political project, and well, in order to, let's say, historically nobilitate the Soviet industrial project. And this marked a very important shift in the Soviet understanding of history. So history starts to be important again roughly in the 1930s. The creation of Soviet Kolchis thus not only served economic purposes, it was also intended to anchor the Soviet Union historically in the world history. The mythical and historical ancient saga was ideologically reinterpreted. The Argonaut saga and the archaeological excavations in the Kolchian plain testified to the heroic past of this country. The legend of Golden Fleece proves that heroic fight of freedom of the Colchians against the conquerors. The conquerors were, of course, the Argonauts. The Colchians were stylized as precursors of the Soviet laborers who had to assert themselves in a hostile capitalist environment and now build up the new paradise, the new Colchians. The second time later, the time of decline, so after that came the time of decline, after the Golden Colchians, and this is the whole, let's say, medieval history of Georgia, was not exactly dated, but it was obviously time of the feudal monarchy and Russian South. We don't have exact details. The introduction to the volume says, this is the new Colchians, where all of the poems of the Soviet Georgian poets are collected. Of how the splendor and power of the ancient Colchians faded and how this former stronghold of wealth and culture turned into stinking malaria pest swamps. In the introduction, the authors of the volume of the poems see deeper causes for this. The editors see it in the endless struggle of Colchians against the conquerors from east and west, so not just west-centered or east-centered, because of which they would no longer have the strength to cope with the forces of nature and to maintain their economic, cultural and state power. This descent of Colchians to the empire of mosquitoes and frogs created a contrasting foil for the reconstruction project of the present. While the sick, impoverished working people of Colchians, as for example Ninoshvili, not Ninoshvili, a Georgian writer, poet, Georgian socialist, described them in the lake of Paliestomi, were not even able to secure their survival. Our heroic people, so says this introduction, led the struggle for the reconstruction of Colchians in the present day, liberated by the great party of Lenin and Stalin. Of central importance for the subject was the mythical demiurge art. The fertile soil is turned from the sea and transformed into a new paradise. So we have actually in the Soviet myth the afterlife of the old mythology, where the demiurge has to win the land from the sea and establish a new order. And we have a number of very bizarre poems, for example, one poem by Georgian poet Ilia, who praises Beria, who was Stalin's first lieutenant, let's say, at the time, the Minister of Interior, mass murderer as well, as Stalin was. So he describes Beria as a demiurge who personally creates this new land and new order. He descends in the deeps of the sea, comes out, and then establishes the new paradise. Now I will come to two texts which are, in my opinion, crucial for the understanding of the semantics of the sea. And one of them is Otar Gilada's novel A Man Went Down the Road, 1973, and the second one is Akamo Gilada's novel Santa Esperanza, 2001. And this is important to, I think Bella Tipuria will speak about Gilada's novel as well. And this is important to know that Gilada, so what he does, he writes his novel as a polemic against this Soviet new Colchians idea. So if the Soviets transformed the empire of mosquitoes and frogs, so all these swamps, to the paradise, for him Colchians will be a swamp. So it was formerly the paradise, but after the conquest it became a swamp. So this is a very strong polemical text. The first part of the novel is an alterated, comprehensive version of the Argonaut myth, focused not only on the Greeks but on Colchians. And this is very typical for Georgian, that everything that has to do with Argonauts takes part in Colchians. So what happened afterwards is absolutely insignificant and unimportant for this Georgian discourse. The novel describes a phenomenon which we can, with some caution or with no caution at all, a national trauma. This trauma is a loss of independence, the conquest of mythical Colchians and its capital Vani to the Cretan empire of Minos. which echoes the loss of independence by Georgian kingdoms after 1801 to Russia, and of the Georgian Democratic Republic to the Bolsheviks in 1921. The intriguingly intact is the topographical expression of this trauma in the novel's plot. This is Departure of the Sea. The main scenery of the novel is Vani, a seaport at the beginning of the novel, and it is the sea that defines Vani as a part of the world and as the space of negotiation. Paradoxically enough, the sea route is of the one-way nature. And this is also important because the world at some point for Colchians or for Georgians for 150 years ends at the western shore, so from Georgian perspective, of the Black Sea. They never travel. So other people come, but they never travel themselves. This means that Colchians are thus narrative participants of the world, meaning that their experience does not imply their own locomotion. Paradoxically, this fatal immobility laid out at different levels and registers of the novel becomes a plot-generating and shaping force of the novel. The Vanians' journeys are a series of failures. The Colchian ship that should have taken the husband of King Aedes' elder daughter, Tarisa, which is absent from the myth, and this is also, the husband is the mythologically well-known Phrixos, the first Greek on the Colchian soil. So he wants to sail back to Greece, but he dies. So he suddenly dies before he can go to Greece. The flight of Medea, another notorious protagonist of Argonaut myth, ends with an impossibility of integration in the new place, and on the literary level develops several well-known tragedies. So she is not able to integrate in the foreign land. Vanian warriors, led by Medea's brother Aplasion, this is another version of Apsirtes, who sail to bring Medea and the Golden Fleece back, return dead to Vani. But the quintessence of the anti-journey is the journey of Karnaos, the protagonist of the third part of the novel, the only Vanian traveler who leaves Vani to become what we can now call Gastarbeiter in Creta and come back alive. We cannot speak of any positive experience of his journey abroad, of something learned or brought home, but on the contrary of complete loss of identity, including gender markers. In the topographical order of Vani, parting from the homeland, departure from the place of origin, traveling leads to complete loss of identity and becomes the death metaphor. So we have now what Giladze does. This is also this romantic autochthone topography with the center in the homeland and the travel, or so if you travel or if you go somewhere else, it is a death metaphor. And Giladze's novel applies this autochthonic order not only to individuals but also to the whole city. And the central event of the plot, departure of the sea and the turning Vani into a swamp, described in eschatological metaphors, affects also the whole community. As Vanians do believe, the sea left them because of some great sin. The mention of sin adds, of course, biblical registers to the mythic space of Vani and simultaneously reveals sacrality to the autochthonic order. The only protagonist of the novel, fisherman Bedia, who both figuratively and literally does not lose ties with the sea, says, "We have forgotten the sea. This is why such things happen in our land." And significantly, Bedia is the only person who, unlike others, does not say that sea has forgotten Colchians. He says, we Colchians have forgotten the sea. And this is a very important point. This view gives us a radically different possibility to interpret the initial scene of Vani. The sea does not only step back from Vani, it becomes also unfruitful. If, in turn, then the fruitfulness of the sea is not only its natural resources, but also its possibility of exchange and negotiation. And then we can link the departure and unfruitfulness of the sea with the autochthone phobias. This phobia of change is connected to thalassophobia, which regards sea as a threat, as a road that can lead to loss of individual and political identity. Autochthon phobias logically demand closing of the maritime border. So if you are in this autochthon logic, the sea is nothing but danger. So I tend to interpret the central event of the plot, the loss of the sea, as the logical consequence of translating of autochthonic order, which is the Georgian mythology, which is the Georgian romantic spatial order, to the political space. The mythological autochthony, regarded as paradisical state, transformed into political space, generates autochthonic phobias of change, and ultimately leads in the political space to the self-isolation. The loss of the sea, the initial sin of Vanians, can be thus read as inability to understand and overcome the threat of autochthonic order. And in this autochthon spatial model, Georgia lives, let's say, for 150 years, starting from late Georgian Romanticism in 1850s and 60s until recently. And it was the Georgian writer Adam Mochiladze who radically questioned the previous symbolic and spatial planning of Georgia. 2001. His polyphonic novel Santa Esperanza was published in 2004. Sorry. The novel consists of 36 small booklets, which, like deck of the cards, are arranged according to 4 colors and 9 rows of numbers, so you can combine it in every possible way. The novel is stylistically very diverse, so Mochiladze uses almost the entire range of expressions of Georgian prose, from medieval chronicles to contemporary criminal slang. And the book contains pastiches on Georgian translation prose of the 19th and 20th centuries, excerpts of fictitious travel guides, newspaper articles, excerpts from fictitious novels by Santa Esperanza authors, letters, emails, and much more. At the center of the novel is a place that does not exist in reality, but whose history is the result of the totality of all booklets. So the protagonist of this novel is not the person, but the place. And this place is Santa Esperanza. Santa Esperanza is a fictitious archipelago in the eastern Black Sea region. So these islands does not exist, but he puts them roughly on the eastern side of the Black Sea, somewhere between Trabzon, Poti, and Novosibirsk. The history of St. John Islands, as Santa Esperanza is called in Georgian, reflects the history of Georgia, but is not congruent with it. The archipelago, abandoned after Hellenistic times, was occupied and settled by the strange Georgian kingdom in the 12th century. In the 15th century, and we learned this from the website of Santa Esperanza, the islands were largely ruled by the Georgian king independently and by the by noble family who later ascended to the royal dynasty. Later, the islands were occupied by the Ottoman Empire, and in the 19th century, after the Crimean War, became British protectorate. The real power was held by 17 merchant families of Georgian, Genoese, and Turkish descent. How much time do I have?
Half an hour.
You have
Half an hour.
I still have time. Okay,
Yeah.
then maybe I can tell a little bit more about the novel. So the novel plays. So in the novel, the Santa Esperanza is atopos and utopos at the same time. With regard to Georgia and Utopia, it is precisely the difference between Santa Esperanza and actual Georgia that is decisive and important. The difference between Georgia and its insular version is expressed by a Georgian journalist who writes an essay about Santa Esperanza's cemeteries and describes his personal impressions in an email to his editor-in-chief. This is a cool place. If only Georgia were like this. Those fucking Russians. The journalist has a historical explanation for Georgia's tragic history. Russia is to blame for everything, what was bad in Georgian history. But he blames Russia for this because he seems to think that Georgian history would have been different and better without Russia. Even if one is inclined to regard this position, which is quite popular in Georgia, as an authorial one, Mochiladze's answer is not temporal and not political, but spatial. So it deals with the space and not with the history. Already on the first page of the novel, it becomes clear that Morciladze's novel complements the history of Georgia with its missing maritime component. So this is the first real maritime novel in the history of Georgian literature. The geopolitical question that Morciladze poses in his novel shifts the spatial center of gravity from the Caucasus to the Black Sea. The story of Santa Esperanza thus reads as a possible history of Georgia, or alternative history if you wish, with a gravitational point shifted into Black Sea. So how could be Georgian history if its center would be not in the Caucasian mountains but in the Black Sea? The difference between land Georgians and insular doppelganger do not result from the fact that Georgia was colonized by Russia and Santa Esperanza by Great Britain. Both Santa Esperanza and Georgia plunged into bloody civil wars after regaining their independence, but from the radically different cultural mechanisms and basic order. So what would differ? Why these two Georgias are very different? This is because of their spatial philosophy. The shift of the point of gravity is accompanied by a change of maritime semantics. In the fictitious book of also fictional Soviet Georgian researcher Volodya Nebieridze, there is a passage about the semantics of the sea, which is completely false but interesting. Nebieridze placed the fictitious semantic of the Georgian words. The Georgian word for the sea, zghva, is phonetically related to the words of the border, zghvari or sazvari, from which Nebieridze derives a semantic relationship. In contrast, he derives the Santa Esperanza word for the sea from the word imedi, which is hope in English, for which Morciladze constructs a false Achaean etymology. Border and hope thus bring two opposing semantics of the sea to the point from which in turn different cultural mechanisms and the different spatial philosophies result. It is clear, and I quote this fictitious scholar, it is clear what hope means and to what extent it is better for the active person than the border. Therefore, the life of both Georgias is thus as different. So, what happens if you regard the sea as the border or the sea as the hope? The hope is inscribed in maritime semantics and also resonates in the name of archipelago, Santa Esperanza, the Holy Hope. The conflict between the conservative, earthbound, autochthonous and maritime, mobile and spatial philosophy is one of the main conflicts of the entire novel. The Sungali, the inhabitants of Sungali Islands, stand for the conservative and autochthonous principle. They originally arrived in Santa Esperanza as refugees from Georgia. The title of the chapter, Peasants in the Sea, in which the Sungali are introduced, already points the contradiction of spatial claim. So, peasants, Georgos, and the sea. The Sungali differentiated greatly from the original population of the St. John Islands. They were landmen, this was the quote. This is not a simple statement. Land people have certain attitudes to topography and to the resulting way of life, which results from this attitude to topography. I quote, the new arrivals did not like the sea. They discovered a river and went fishing there. The Sungali, as Noel emphasized several times, shared this characteristic with land Georgians who liked the sea only for splashing on the beach. But topographical preferences also go hand in hand with an attitude to life. Since the Sungali were closed, did not travel and were not interested in the outside world, they believed that there are no true people and heroes on the earth apart of them, and all of other people are cowardly creatures and simply bad. So this is this kind of isolational ideology. The rivalry of different spatial principles is also inscribed in the topography of Santa Esperanza. While Sungali Island is orientated towards land Georgia, they have their own island and determine their order as far as possible. The largest island of the archipelago, with the capital and the port city, which is also important, Santa City, is much more cosmopolitan. Life of the main island is dominated by no national or religious group. There are three ancient communities: Georgian ones that speak outdated Georgian, a Genoese one that consists of the descendants of Genoese merchants who fled from Kaffa, and the Turkish one that came to the island after the Ottoman conquest of the archipelago. Santa Esperanza is quadrilingual. Besides Georgian, Italian, and Turkish, there is English. There's the language of the British colonial empire, which dominated Santa Esperanza politically since the Crimean War. And it's also official and educational language. Santa Esperanza has also equal religious rights. So all denominations are forbidden to practice their religious publicly, with exception of funerals. The Sungali, although originally from Katlin, the nobles, share many of the characteristics of Georgian mountain dwellers. But they are less the actual inhabitants of Georgian mountains rather than their literary representations, which since Georgian poet Raphael Elistavi had been responsible for the original, pure and unchanged Georgian culture. So Georgian Romanticism said that in the Caucasus, if you want to find real Georgian who is pure and uncorrupted by colonial discourse and whatever, you can find them only in the Caucasian mountains. While in autochthonous spatial planning, the mountain or the Caucasus was the central point of reference for the preservation of true Georgianhood, for Morchiladze the opposite concept of the opening is a bridge to the future. Georgia is not or no longer to be found in the past, but in its opening, or in the future. But this opening is represented by the Black Sea, which is to be understood as a topographical counterpart of the Caucasus, a sign, which is a sign of the autochthonous spatial order. And yes, I have to skip some things. Yes, and maybe I will close here. So we have this kind of two semantical focal points, which is the Caucasus and the Black Sea. And Morchiladze is maybe the first writer who makes this shift from the Caucasus to the Black Sea, and the first one who tries to semanticize the Black Sea not as a danger, but as a possibility, and we can read and understand his novel as a modeling. So what happens if we do this in such way? So to briefly sum up, we have this kind of development of the Georgian literary discourse of the Black Sea from the more or less neutral or neutral negative in the Middle Ages to the extremely negative in the 19th century, which is because of the Georgian romantic topography, which places the center of Georgia in the middle or in the mountains, and with this kind of recent change towards more open view of the Black Sea. And what is interesting, and maybe what we could do all together, or one of the possible plans, is to look how these different semantics of Black Sea by different groups of people can be compared, or how they differ, or where there were some similarities. I can speak for several of them. For example, the Abkhaz discourse, and you mentioned yesterday this very interesting novel by an Abkhaz writer, Bagratchin Uba, The Last Ubikh, which from the Abkhazian perspective tells the story of the Black Sea, where the Black Sea is also the place of death. So this is a death metaphor. And from the Russian perspective, you have this kind of double ideas. For Pushkin, for example, it is something which is the free space, but you have also the imperial discourse, which is very different. So we have very good possibilities of comparative studies of the Black Sea space, which could open us to a very different, or much more differentiated understanding of cultural semantic of the Black Sea. This is maybe a complementary idea to the espace littéraire, how you put it, Professor Nosolovici, but maybe we can simultaneously move in different directions and find some synergetical effects of our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and I think it was interesting for everybody, for our guests as well as for Georgian scholars, this general overview and very precise analysis of this perception of Black Sea semantics. So now we can discuss, and if you have questions, we have 15 minutes or even more. And perhaps I have just one question regarding what you said about. You mentioned that Titian Babitze was the only one the first who emphasizes this kind of ambivalence in the perception of Black Sea, and not only the sweet danger or good and area, and how his perception inscribes in what you say after regarding the Santa Esperanza. Does it somehow there are some parallels to do, or it's another kind of breaking in his autochthonic perception?
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting question. Tizian is embedded more or less in his context, right, in his contemporary context, and one part of this context is kind of this symbolistic attitude to the sea, which is also something of we cannot speak about very clear symbolistic discourse of the sea, but there are some poems or some poems dedicated to it. And there is, for example, there is a very interesting poem by Andronikashvili, 4 poets by the sea, and this is a kind of, they try to be friends with the sea and try to flirt with the sea, but then they are pushed back to the land, right? And Titian goes even farther, because for him the sea, so he thinks in his later poems, Jordan spoke yesterday about, in his later poems, already in the, so he's already in the logic of the Soviet project of the Baltics, where the land becomes positively connotated and the sea is something dangerous and you have to win the land from the sea, and he is in a very subtle but also very sharp polemic with the Soviet project. So for him the water is still something, maybe the place of death, but he identifies himself with the swamp or with the water, with the aquatic area. So that's why I spoke about this ambivalence. So he is not anymore in the Georgian romantic paradigm. He is not in the Soviet paradigm, but he's still not in the. He does not still go so far as Mochilada goes to, well, try to semanticize the sea as a possibility.
Thanks for this very, very rich lecture, and you are absolutely right. I can see the connection between your research orientation and what I could hear we are trying to invest. I have 3 questions. Okay, I will start by maybe the most disturbing one. Since the amputation of Georgian territory and that the access to the Black Sea is kind of forbidden, is there in your analysis a reinvestment of the mountain symbolism? Like Georgian identity should forget about the Black Sea reference and get back to the mountain reference. Second question, you did mention in your narrative the Soviet period. This Soviet period in your narrative, is that really a chapter among the other chapters of your narrative, or something else, like a parenthesis in your narrative? And the third question, about the third book, Santa Esperanza, obviously kind of postmodern, stylistic, and I mean, the names of Italo Calvino or Nabokov could pop up in my mind. And I wonder if, now I'm getting back to my research, if the notion of espace littéraire, literary space, could be exposed to postmodernism without the risk of being totally destroyed. That means I still think that there is in the notion of literary space an ethical claim which cannot resist or which cannot be put together with this very cruel, very harsh, cynical postmodernism. What's your opinion? What's your stand on that?
Thank you very much for these very important questions. Yeah, they point indeed to the center, to the very important, well, neurological points of thought. Well, the first question, whether there is an idea to forget the Black Sea and come back to the mountains because of the loss of the territory and especially of Abkhazia. Maybe to speak of Abkhazian Georgian literature, strangely enough, there are not so many texts who reflect these current political developments, and the texts that we have are not geopoetical at all, let's say. So, strangely enough, there is no way back in the recent contemporary Georgian literature to this romantic geopoetics. So we find the model Georgian somewhere in the mountains. This doesn't happen anymore. So I think this 150 years had said everything about the mountains that could be said. It is also present in the Soviet time and Soviet. So, but Borchilata's text is simultaneously maybe the only maritime text as well. So we now are in the geopoetically more or less neutral situation where the topic is not touched by many writers or only by few. So the answer would be rather no than yes. The second question, whether it is whether the Soviet period is parenthesis or the chapter, well, it is difficult to say. So this question would be dependent, or the answer would be dependent on how you see the Georgian poets who participated in this project. Would you see the Soviet Georgian literature as a part of Georgian literature or not? I would say this is a part of Georgian literature, of course. Georgian writers who are now mostly neglected, you can still see them in the topography of Tbilisi, for example, on the Mosashvili streets, maybe 200 meters away from here. But literally they are not really part of the literary memory. But I think this is still a chapter because of, well, at least one reason. And this one reason is that this is a point of polemics for Georgian literature, because Abidze is in polemic with the Soviet discourse, Chiladze is in polemic with the Soviet discourse, and they place themselves and relate themselves to this. So their thinking about geopolitics and geopoetics relates to this Soviet time. So that's why I would think it is rather a chapter than a parenthesis. And as I said, it is also very important because Georgia, which is regarded as a periphery for the Soviet Union, is still a model for certain developments. And for example, this rediscovery of Georgia in the Stalinism, the rediscovery of history in Stalinism happens in Georgia. 1934 we have this first Soviet Writers' Congress, where Georgian delegation is the only one who speaks about the literature as a history of literature. So they don't say doesn't speak about proletarian literature. They say our literature starts in the 5th century with the church texts, and this is something very shocking and absolutely counter Gorky's idea of the Soviet literature. And this thing with Koltis is the same thing. So suddenly you prize the workers and maybe peasants as well, and suddenly you rediscover this kind of ancient Kolkians and say, okay, these are our predecessors. And this is also very disturbing and very interesting, so I would see it also as a chapter. And the third question, which is a very, very good one, about ethics of literary space and postmodern. Morciladze is a very rich in his forms. So this is maybe one postmodern novel, and this is postmodern only formal. So he remains, his form is, he plays with these forms, he uses it, but he is extremely, well, so he has ethics. It is not just a play for the sake of the play. He is very philosophical, and he is maybe the only person who thought philosophically about the geopoetics of Georgia. So where do we or how do we relate spatially? So that's why I would say we can leave the form to the form, and if we go deeper, he's not just I would say not the epicon postmodernist of the later times who just saw a beautiful form and thought maybe we can do something. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There were one question. Sorry, there was one question.
There, I think you were.
And then, no.
Just through it. It's okay. Okay, no problem.
Oh, sorry, I just have a very short question to follow up on what you were talking. It's about this Soviet idea of and also the appropriation of myths for industrial projects. And I was just wondering whether actually you know who were in charge of this particular appropriation. I mean, whether we know anything about the history of how actually it happened, where the inspiration came from and who was kind of...
So the volume I was referring to is edited by Simon Cicolani, who was former Georgian futurist and afterwards one of the heads of the Georgian Union's writer, and Kandil Charkuyani, who was after Beria the first secretary of Georgian Communist Party and de facto head of Georgia, let's say, in that period. So I think it was something between this Beria and writer's line. How conscious it was obviously conscious, but who gave the hint is difficult to say, but it is in line with this rediscovery of history in the Soviet Union. And Georgia is obviously one of the places where this is tested. So testing balloon is here. And I think it might have been born somewhere between this Georgian communists like Stalin, Beria, Charkuyani, possibly, but I cannot prove. But it's interesting. So it's interesting to follow this up.
Thank you very much for this interesting and I would say controversial lecture. This is kind of fashion just to speak about Georgia, which is a line to the sea nowadays, and this sea, they consider sea, Black Sea, a threat to them. I do not agree with it, and I will not go very deeply in the old Georgian literature. My colleagues here, maybe Nino Dobrogiridis and Ilia, could do it with a bigger success, but I should say just that Aga Morchiladze is not the first writer in Georgian literature who just made the sea and the whole Georgia just a strategic line and the aim of Georgian state. We have the very interesting writer in the 20th century, Levan Gotua, who wrote a novel, Mitridate, where this line and this strategic role and the aim of Georgia to go to the West and be Western culture is just written very... No, it's not written Mirtavarami. I see that you haven't read the novel. So,
which one do you refer?
So, Mitridate. So this is my, not the question, but just the contribution to your lecture.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry because my English, I'm not so familiar with English so that I could understand everything. I would like to speak a little about the third question of Alexei and the book of Morchiladze. I hope it is translated in English. In English, okay. So I will find it. Oh, I'm sorry with this English. Your answer was very interesting for me because with some Bulgarian postmodern writers, and I think especially about Georg Gospodinov, I'm convinced that first, there is not one postmodernism, but there are several postmodernisms, and I am convinced that postmodernism in Bulgaria, in Georgia, or in other lands, other literatures, can, I say it in French, je suis vraiment convaincue que des postmodernismes dans d'autres littératures peuvent apporter vraiment quelque chose d'autre à la connaissance qu'on a du postmodernisme. Et notamment dans le fait, ce qui me frappe, c'est que très souvent, effectivement, on associe le postmodernisme à quelque chose de cynique. Alors, si je pense par exemple à un auteur comme Basara, un auteur serbe, effectivement, il y a un cynisme, il y a un nihilisme très fort chez lui. Mais je pense que dans beaucoup de littérature de nos régions plus à l'est qu'à l'est de l'ouest, il y a, comme vous le disiez, un postmodernisme. C'est-à-dire que la forme postmoderne permet beaucoup de choses. C'est une forme ouverte qui permet vraiment d'ouvrir aussi la littérature et le roman, mais tout en ayant effectivement une réflexion absolument philosophique sur le monde dans lequel on vit.
უფრო ცინიკურ ლიტერატურას და შესაძლოა რამდენი ავტორებთან ესეც იყოს. მაგრამ განსაკუთრებით ისეთ ლიტერატურებში, ანუ პოსტმოდერნულ ლიტერატურაში და განსაკუთრებით ამ შემთხვევაში აღმოსავლეთ ქვეყნებზე საუბარი შეიძლება უფრო მეტად ვიდრე დასავლეთზე, პოსტმოდერნიზმი იძლევა საშუალებას უფრო ფილოსოფიურ მდგომას.
Well, I would agree. So it is interesting to talk about postmodern. Morchiladze would not see himself, I think, as a postmodernist writer, and so this is. He
doesn't think himself as a postmodernist.
He just yes, we have postmodernist writers, for example, Zula Karonidze, who is more or less very consciously inscribe himself in the postmodern tradition, whereas Morchiladze does not. But he obviously has a big repertoire of forms, and one of his forms is that. But yes, I would agree that and it's interesting what he writes in his introduction. I don't know whether it is true or whether it's made up, but I think he had just a huge material, and out of this material he made 2 or 3 Santa Esperanza novels. This is the most important one. He said that he had difficulties to order this material to something, and then he found this idea of the card play. Card play, and this card play is not just card play, but this is very important for the book itself, because this play of cards, which is called Inti, is kind of religion for the Santa Esperanza. And Inti means to be on, not to go away, but to escape. Yes, it means escape. So this kind of idea of escape is very important, and but I agree that yes, it can be, it has not been cynical. And for example, the other one, Karumidze, is extremely ironic but not cynical. So the irony is something that is maybe essential for the postmodernity, but or for the Georgian postmodernity, but not the cynical, or not just, let's say, to the form play for the sake of the form play. It has always something which goes deeper. And in regard to the difference between modernity and postmodernity in Georgia, so the problem in Georgia that Georgia's modernity was cut violently in the Soviet times, right? So we had this cut. So for Georgian philosophers, for example, Merab Mamardashvili, to come back and to find this back to the tradition of the classical modernity is a task, is a philosophical task. So he thinks our renewal is not in the postmodernity, but we should go back to the classical modernity, and for him the authors like Proust and Musil are the points of reference. So not Deleuze and not Derrida, so not late Deleuze and not Derrida, but he goes back to rather to the classical modern authors. And I think this is possibly typical for the whole Georgian culture. So we would rather go back and continue this cut traditions of the modernity rather than copy the postmodernity of the 90s. If it's the answer to your question.
Yes. And, I think it's like, I don't like to monopolize the conversation, but what you say, I could say the same for Bulgarian literature. Postmodernism is a way to put the Soviet in
thank you. This is very interesting because we'll maybe speak about this later, but these similarities between the literatures of, I would say, for example, Georgia and Bulgaria had to be explored more thoroughly in order to make the view of the, let's say, European literature or world literature more differentiated. I think there are lots of things to do still.
I liked a lot your conference, thank you. I have just a curiosity. You said that Tamar is the most important Georgian queen. It's about a cultural revolution during his period of political domination, which are the cultural texts linked to the to his political influence. I don't know about that.
Of Tamar, you mean?
Yes.
Of Queen Tamar?
Yes.
So she was a medieval queen, right? And her influence cannot. So she is a point of reference for the whole, Georgian culture afterwards. So if they, both in popular culture or in the let's say high culture, she is referred as a golden age of Georgia. With regard to the cultural revolution, maybe it's more connected to Rustaveli than to Queen Tamar, but this goes simultaneously because he was the one who not invents, but let's say establishes the worldly Georgian, secular Georgian literature as absolutely equal, if not prevail to the church Georgian literature. So this is the cultural revolution that takes part, let's say, starting from the David IV to Queen Tamar. This is the establishment of Georgian secular culture. This is the importance of it.
Other questions?
I would like to thank you for this enlightening presentation. It inspired many thoughts indeed. And I find that it's a very interesting but atypical case. I don't think there are too many other cases you could trace parallel developments of a discussion between the place sea would occupy as opposed to the mountains or the hinterland, whatever that part of the story. But this is not a question but some speculation on what your presentation inspired in my mind. Now, usually people go out to the sea because of deprivation. They are forced to. They search for food, they search for metals, what they don't have. And it's a last resort. And mountains and inlands can be quite fertile and dependable as long as population is below a certain threshold. Okay? And this may have been one of the factors that distinguish the Caucasus in general, and perhaps more so Georgia because it's replenished with water resources much more effectively. So that this push was never as strong as elsewhere. And so the mountains did not only stand for a certain notion of liberty and things like that, but they also provided people with sufficient food resources and what they needed to maintain their life as usual. It's only when they see life elsewhere develop much more, providing new utilities and things like that, they aspire obviously, and then things change. But other than that, this may be one reason for the attraction and survival of the idea of the highlands as an alternative to the sea for so long in the minds of the people. This is just what I wanted to add. But what also inspired me in thinking this way was a book I, by coincidence, picked up in a bookstore last time I was in Georgia. It was about the fish of Georgia. And they had description of species of fish which are available. And by looking at that, you see that most of that fish actually originate from streams and small lakes, ponds, and so forth, in numbers as species kind, versus what is available in the Black Sea now. Okay? And this is, of course, very unique. This is not something you would see in many of the countries that are on the coastline of the Black Sea. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. This is a very interesting point. I've never thought of that in these terms, but I think it would be a really very good explanation for the reason of the cultural semantics.